The nature of existence, or what it means for a thing to exist, or what it means for us to assert that a thing exists, is a notoriously difficult subject to talk and think about. Philosophers have been grappling with the issue for millennia, and precious few of them did more than a fairly poor job of it. But I'm prepared to cut them some slack over that precisely because of the level of difficulty. Now, when I say that it's difficult, I don't mean it's complicated. Difficult and complicated aren't synonymous. Existence is not really a complicated issue. It just requires some conceptual leaps that at times may seem counterintuitive. And that can be a hard thing for the mind to entertain. The issue of existence is tricky because of the ubiquitous and essential or foundational nature of the thing. In talking about it, it's next to impossible to define the terms without falling into the trap of using synonyms to do so. I don't know about your experience, but mine has been that if you ask most people what it means for a thing to exist, they'll say something along the lines of, to exist means to be. A thing exists if it has being. But to be is merely a synonym for to exist. It adds nothing and contains no explanatory force. We're none the wiser about the nature of existence as a consequence of such a definition. So, yes, it's kind of tough, but we here at Men of the Infinite aren't scared off by the difficult, so I'm going to dive straight into the deep end and say some things about the nature of existence and what it means for a thing to exist. And of course, if you find me slipping into the aforementioned trap of using synonyms, please let me know. Don't let me get away with anything. The first thing to be said about existence is that it's a designation. Existence is a thing asserted or designated by an observer. The reason why this is necessarily so will become clearer as we go along. That the quality of existence is a thing designated by an observer is proven, in part, by the fact that existence requires identity. That is to say, an existent thing must be differentiated and differentiable from that which it is not, to be capable of being granted thingness or identity as an individual phenomenon. If any given thing is not demarcated or bounded in some way from what it is not, it must, of necessity, be the totality of all that is. Now, I hope this point is obvious enough such that I don't have to expand on it further. I mean, clearly if a thing is not bounded or demarcated at all, it must be everything. But this is where the necessity of the observer comes in, because demarcations and differentiations are products of observers, whatever and whomever they may be. Boundaries are an artifact of mind. So this leads me to my working definition of exist, which is, a thing is said to exist if it presents an appearance to an observer. Now, this naturally applies to the abstract as well as the empirical, as it must. Any definition of existence that doesn't incorporate the abstract as well as the empirical is going to be, to my mind, absurd from the outset. Though I can tell you I've known scores of people who seem to want to divorce the abstract from their notions of existence. Seemingly, they don't think the content of their mind exists. At times, the sarcastic part of me wishes to agree, but I guess, to be fair to them, it's because they have become so utterly entrenched in thinking about things empirically that that's become the only sense of existence their minds can accommodate. But let me dwell on this point of identity for a little bit, because it's very important. One of the few things that Aristotle got right was his formulations for the foundations of logic, pivotal to those being the law of identity, which basically states that a thing is itself and not something else, and indeed can't be something else. A very useful way to depict this law is with the formulation A equals A. The law of identity, and A equals A as a way to express it, will prove very helpful in our considerations of the nature of existence. But more than that, we're about to do what a great many people vigorously assert to be impossible or fanciful. That is, we're about to know and understand a universal, absolute, and eternal fact of existence. I hope you're excited by that prospect. The law of identity speaks to the bare essentials of existence. Anything requires identity to exist. Identity requires demarcation for the reason I gave earlier. So we can say that things can only exist relative to what they are not. No thing can exist of itself, because without demarcation, differentiation, relativity, boundedness, a given thing would not and could not be at all. The beauty of this understanding of the essential nature of existence is that it cuts across and is the basis of all possible forms of thought, all possible systems of thinking about reality, metaphysical, ontological, and so forth. The truth of A equals A underpins any philosophical system whatsoever, and must be true in all possible worlds, at all possible times. In other words, everywhere and everywhen. Thought itself cannot arise without it, because thought has its own basis in identity and its logical consequence. Without all the things I've just stated about existence, there literally couldn't be anything to think about. We don't at this point have to consider if things are real or illusory, objective or subjective. A equals A, and the points I've made still hold. Now let me just quickly address an argument that's been thrown at me from time to time regarding this issue. That being that some people claim that they can conceive of a single thing existing by itself in the midst of nothingness, demarcated and differentiated from nothing whatsoever. That is, they can think of a thing that exists purely of itself. Prima facie, this may seem like a reasonable argument, but it actually defeats itself even in its own formulation. On the screen you'll see a representation of this argument, a lone thing in the midst of nothingness. But what is that nothingness? Isn't it a something that we differentiate from the object? Doesn't it demarcate and give identity to the object? Does that nothingness have any reality of its own, or does it require somethingness to even have meaning? I'll let you draw your own conclusions on that particular question. So, the next time someone tries to tell you that there's no such thing as universal truths, absolute truths of existence, throw A equals A their way and see if it makes them sweat a little. At the very least, it ought to cause them to rethink their position, because it only requires a single counterexample to refute their claim, and you've just given them one. Okay, I'm about out of time for part one of this particular series. In part two, I'll be introducing the leaf that I previously promised. I'll be using it to talk about the nature of the demarcations, the boundaries discussed in this presentation, and I'll be addressing the question, where do things begin and end? And do they begin and end at all? I hope you'll stick around with us for the rest of this discussion on the nature of existence. Bye for now, and remember that truth is valuable.